People often believe that the hardest things a man can say are delivered in anger. They picture raised voices, slammed doors, and sharp words that leave scars long after the moment passes. But in my 40 years with Edward, I learned something different. The harshest words a person can speak are the ones whispered quietly, with fear behind them instead of fury. That was the tone he used the night he made me promise to stay away from the mountain cabin. It wasn't a suggestion, and it wasn't a nostalgic comment about a place from his past. It was a plea he could barely push out of his throat. He was sitting at the kitchen table, folding laundry with me the way we always did on Sunday evenings. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. It was an ordinary night, warm from the oven heat and smelling faintly of cinnamon tea. But when I mentioned a photo I'd found in an old box, one of him standing outside a small cabin tucked between tall Colorado pines, he froze. The towel he held slipped from his hands, his face drained of color, and the smile he'd been wearing just minutes earlier faded completely. "Don't ever go to that cabin, Martha. I mean it. Promise me you'll never set foot near it." I laughed at first, thinking he was being dramatic about an old family property or a place tied to embarrassing childhood memories. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I realized how wrong I was. His expression wasn't amused or irritated. It was terrified. I had seen Edward worried before, after Jenna's car accident when she was 17, or when his father suffered a stroke. But I had never seen the kind of fear he showed me in that moment. It chilled me all the way through. So I promised him, not because I understood, but because I loved him enough to respect whatever shadows lived behind that request. Over the years, I learned not to bring it up again. The cabin became one of those unspoken pieces of our marriage, floating silently between us whenever old memories surfaced. I didn't question his past any more than he questioned the grief I carried from my own childhood. Some subjects don't get touched, and we built a peaceful life by honoring that boundary. All of that changed the day he died. Edward passed quickly. One moment he was holding a grocery bag in our driveway, and the next he was collapsing onto the pavement. The doctors said it was sudden cardiac arrest, a quick, final kind of passing that gives no time for goodbyes or explanations. One minute I was a wife, and the next I was a widow, standing in an empty kitchen trying to remember how to breathe. 2 weeks after the funeral, when I was still moving through my days in a quiet fog, I found myself sitting across from his longtime financial advisor. The office was lined with oak shelves and soft yellow lamps that made the room feel too warm for the kind of coldness I carried inside. I had come expecting to sign a few forms, maybe close some accounts, and leave without much thought. I just wanted the tasks to be over so I could go home and sit in Edward's recliner for a while. That chair had become my anchor in a house that suddenly felt too large. Instead, the advisor pulled out a small wooden box. It looked old, polished from years of handling, and far too personal for routine paperwork. He slid it gently toward me, like it carried something fragile. "Mrs. Carver," he said in a low voice, "your husband left this with instructions that it only be given to you after his passing." I stared at the box, uneasy. My hands felt cold as I reached for it. Inside was an iron key on a worn leather strap. The metal was aged, heavy, and shaped in the old style used for mountain cabins or historical buildings. Beneath it lay a folded sheet of paper with my name written in Edward's neat handwriting. "What is this?" I whispered. The advisor exhaled, as if preparing himself. He pulled out a map, an old topographic sheet marked with red pencil lines tracking a trail deep into the Colorado high country. "He purchased a property 3 years ago," he explained. a mountain cabin he never disclosed to you. My stomach tightened as if I'd swallowed a stone. A cabin. Colorado. The cabin. But I thought he told me never to go there. My voice sounded small, even to me. He did repurchase it, the advisor continued. He restored it, actually, renovated it extensively. He also left clear instructions that you were only to visit after his death. He paused, watching me carefully. He wanted you to see something for yourself, something he built. I opened the letter with a hand that trembled so badly the paper crackled. My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, I am gone. And I'm sorry for the pain I know you're in. There are things I wanted to tell you, but fear kept my mouth shut. That fear doesn't bind me anymore. The cabin is yours now. Every board, every window, every inch of land. I rebuilt it for you, not as a monument to my past, but as a gift for your future. Please go once, just once. After that, what you do with it is your choice. Inside, you'll find a laptop on the desk. The password is the date we moved into our first home and your middle name, all together. Start with the video labeled Day 1. Everything you need to know will be in there. I love you more deeply than my words ever managed to say. Edward. My eyes blurred as I read. He had kept this secret for 3 years. 3 years of rebuilds, trips, planning, and fear, and I had sensed none of it. The advisor cleared his throat and added one more complication. I should warn you, Mrs. Carver. Edward's cousins have contacted our office, Richard and Lloyd Vaughan. They believe they have a right to the property due to family lineage. I've never met them, I said, startled. They believe the land is valuable. Water rights, tourism potential, mineral interest. A developer has been surveying nearby. They've already asked to be included in any estate discussions. I held the map tighter. The key pressed into my palm, as though reminding me of something Edward wanted me to understand. I'm going to Colorado, I said quietly. He nodded, as if Edward had predicted that would be my answer. 2 days later, after booking a last-minute flight and renting a 4-wheel-drive SUV at the airport, I found myself driving through winding mountain roads lined with golden aspens. The air felt sharper than the Kansas plains ever offered. Every mile took me deeper into the shadow of tall pines, and every turn brought a mix of anticipation and unease. When I reached the end of the trail, marked on the map, the cabin came into view. It wasn't the broken-down place I had imagined all these years. It stood tall and solid, with fresh cedar siding and a wide deck that overlooked a sweep of land framed by rugged peaks. The windows gleamed in the afternoon light, and the roof looked newly installed. It was beautiful in a quiet, sturdy way that felt very much like the man who had built a life with me. My steps felt heavy as I approached the door. The key slid into the lock and turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for me. The interior was warm and surprisingly elegant for a mountain cabin. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, polished to a soft shine. Quilts hung neatly across the back of a couch, and I recognized the patterns instantly. They were the same designs I've spent years collecting at thrift shops and estate sales. A shelf of books lined the wall, novels I loved, memoirs I'd read more than once, and even titles I'd mentioned casually in passing. A feeling washed over me that I can only describe as a quiet shock. Edward had been here. Edward had known these shelves, chosen these items, arranged this space with a purpose I didn't yet understand. On the desk near the window sat a silver laptop. A yellow sticky note rested on top. Start with Day 1. Before I could reach for it, I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. I stepped toward the window and saw a black SUV pulling up behind my rental. Two men stepped out, both carrying themselves with the assertive confidence of people used to getting their way. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, grey at the temples, walked toward the porch. His face had enough resemblance to Edward that my breath caught for a moment. He knocked firmly on the door. "Mrs. Carver," he called out, "please open the door. We need to discuss the property." My heart thudded loudly. I stepped back from the door, unsure of what to do or say. His tone wasn't friendly. It was authoritative, edged with impatience. "This is a family matter," he continued. "I'm Richard Vaughan, Edward's cousin." I didn't move. Something deep inside me warned against opening that door. The knock came again, harder this time. "Mrs. Carver, I know you're in there. We aren't here to cause trouble. We just need to clarify ownership before things get complicated." That word, complicated, tightened my stomach. I glanced at the laptop again, feeling as though the answers I needed were on the other side of that screen. I reached out, lifted the lid, and entered the password Edward had given me. The screen lit up with a folder labelled, "For Martha. Start with day." 1. I clicked the first video. Edward appeared on the screen, sitting in this same cabin. He looked healthier, younger, and more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He smiled gently, the way he always did when he wanted to soften bad news. "Hello, my girl," he said. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and I'm guessing Richard is already pounding on the door. Don't answer him. Not yet. Let me explain first." My breath caught hearing his voice again. He continued, "There's a reason I kept this place from you, a reason I rebuilt it the way I did, and a reason my cousins suddenly want it back. Please watch this whole message before you do anything else." The knocking outside grew sharper. Edward's recorded voice didn't waver. "You're safer staying right where you are, Martha. Start with the beginning. Trust me. You'll understand soon." I sat down slowly as the video continued to play, and for the first time since he died, I felt like Edward was right there beside me, guiding me into the truth he had tried so desperately to protect. Hearing Edward's voice through that laptop screen was like opening a window after months of stale air. Grief had left me dull and numb, but his words came through with such clarity that they cut through the fog I'd been living in since his death. Outside the cabin, Richard continued knocking, more annoyed than concerned, but I kept my eyes on the image of my husband. His recorded presence felt more real than the man pounding on the door. "Let him think you're not here," Edward said gently through the speakers. "Richard was always impatient. He'll leave before he risks causing a scene." He leaned closer to the camera, as if he could see the panic he knew I'd have. "Start by listening, Martha. Everything else can wait." I closed the curtains and moved deeper into the cabin, letting Richard's voice fade behind me. The walls seemed to absorb the sound until it became a distant, muffled hum. When I replayed the video to catch every nuance of Edward's tone, I realized something I hadn't expected. He wasn't just leaving instructions. He was preparing me for something he knew would be difficult, maybe even dangerous. After 15 minutes, the knocking stopped. I peeked through a small gap in the curtains. Richard and the man who must have been Lloyd stood talking beside their SUV, both looking frustrated. Eventually, they climbed back in and drove down the gravel road, disappearing into the trees. I didn't feel relief, only a deeper curiosity mixed with a lingering dread about what they wanted. Once they were gone, I returned to the laptop. The folder labelled Day 1 held a single video, but below that sat hundreds more, each one dated in order, stretching a full year into the future. Edward had recorded messages for me every day of the year following his death. I stared at the names of the video files, overwhelmed at the sheer dedication it must have taken. I clicked on the second video, needing more answers. Edward appeared again, sitting in the same spot but wearing a different shirt. His face carried a softer expression, touched with sadness. "If Richard and Lloyd haven't reached out to you yet, they will," he said. "I'm sorry about that. They were part of my childhood, but not in any meaningful way. They cared more about the land than they ever cared about me." He paused, studying the camera as if he knew exactly how I would react. "I know this is confusing, Martha. You're standing in a place that holds decades of memories, mostly awful ones, and I never shared any of it with you. I was ashamed to talk about that part of my life." I leaned forward instinctively, trying to take in every detail. Edward rarely spoke of shame. It wasn't in his nature. He was steady and strong, a calm presence in every difficulty we faced. To hear him admit to anything resembling fear was unsettling. He continued, "This cabin wasn't always what you see now. When I was a boy, it was falling apart. My uncle kept it as a place for us to stay during the summers when he wanted cheap help for odd jobs. Those were some of the worst months of my childhood." His expression tightened at the corners. "Richard and Lloyd were older than me. They treated me like a nuisance, sometimes worse." I pressed my hand against my chest to steady the ache rising there. Over the years, I had sensed Edward carried heavy memories, but he never opened that door. Our marriage had been built on mutual respect for each other's private darkness. His gaze grew more intense on the screen. "But you should know something important. I didn't buy this cabin to relive those memories. I bought it to erase them, to rebuild it into something beautiful, something peaceful, something that could be yours." I sat back in the chair, overwhelmed by the depth of his intention. He had spent years creating a sanctuary I didn't even know existed. The video ended, and I took a moment to breathe, letting the quiet sink in around me. The cabin felt different now, alive, filled with invisible traces of Edward's presence. I slowly walked through the main room again, noticing details I had missed in my initial shock. There were blankets folded neatly in a wicker basket beside the couch, a jar of honey from a Kansas beekeeper I favored, a sketchbook on a shelf, unopened but clearly meant for me. It was as if he had taken notes on every small joy I'd ever mentioned and woven them into this place. In the kitchen, the pantry was stocked with foods he knew I liked, and the spices were arranged in alphabetical order, just the way I organized them at home. I opened the fridge and found fresh produce, everything placed carefully. It takes someone who spends time in a place to make it feel lived in, and Edward had clearly lived here more than I ever imagined. I moved into a smaller room that looked like an office. The desk was old and sturdy, with a smooth surface that bore marks of sandpaper and careful restoration. Sitting beside the laptop was a small wooden box filled with pens, pencils, and paper clips, all arranged neatly. Edward was always meticulous about organization, that small habit he brought from his childhood working in his father's garage. It made sense that he'd translated it into the cabin, too. As I explored, I heard the rumble of an approaching truck. I tensed again, peeking through the blinds to see an older pickup roll into the yard. For a second, my heart raced. But then a man stepped out who looked nothing like the Vaughan cousins. He had a long grey beard, worn jeans, and a heavy jacket that looked older than I was. He waved politely. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. "Afternoon," he said kindly. "Name's Caleb Doyle. I'm the ranger who looked after this place for your husband." The tension in my shoulders loosened slightly. His presence felt calm, unthreatening. "Edward mentioned you," I replied softly, stepping outside. "I didn't expect anyone today." "Didn't expect to see you here so soon," Caleb said. "Thought you might need a hand settling in." He glanced around the deck. "Looks like you made it up before the first real snow. That's good. Once it hits, this road gets tricky." I invited him in, grateful for company that wasn't trying to pound the door down. Caleb wiped his boots on the mat before entering, a small gesture that spoke volumes about his character. He walked through the space with familiarity, though he tread lightly, as if he respected the privacy of a home he'd been tending from the outside. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said after a moment. "Edward was a good man, one of the best I've met." My throat tightened. "Thank you. He never told me much about this place." Caleb nodded slowly. "Not surprising. He didn't talk about it to anyone. But he came up here a lot more than you might think, mostly in the last couple of years." "How often?" I asked. "Every month or so, sometimes more. He worked on this cabin with his own hands, spent long days repairing everything, brought in contractors when he needed them, but oversaw every detail." I tried to imagine Edward, who had spent years as a dedicated systems technician, climbing ladders, repairing beams, sanding walls. He wasn't a handyman by nature, but he was a determined one, steady and careful. Caleb studied me with a thoughtful expression. "He told me he was building a future for you here." I swallowed hard. "He never told me he was coming." "He wouldn't," Caleb said simply. "Edward didn't want you to worry or ask questions he wasn't ready to answer." Something in the way he spoke made my pulse pick up. "What exactly did he say to you?" "He told me to keep an eye on the property, keep things running smooth, and never let anyone up here without his say-so, especially his cousins." The mention of Richard and Lloyd returned the heaviness to my chest. "They came earlier today. They tried to push their way in." Caleb's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he wasn't easily rattled. "Figures. They've been sniffing around since the developers started scouting the area. They want the water rights on your land, and they don't want competition." "Water rights?" I echoed. He nodded. "This cabin sits on top of a natural spring, one of the last deep aquifers in this part of the mountains. Developers want it for a resort. Richard wants it for himself." The pieces began forming a picture I hadn't expected. Edward hadn't just bought a sentimental property. He'd bought something valuable, something people were willing to fight for. "Your husband didn't trust them," Caleb added. "Said they'd try to take this land from whoever inherited it." "And he knew that would be me," I said quietly. "He knew," Caleb agreed. I felt the weight of Edward's planning settle over me like a heavy blanket. He had prepared for this. He had known exactly what kind of storm would come knocking the moment he was gone. When Caleb left, promising to check in again after the weekend, I returned to the laptop for the next video. Edward appeared wearing a plaid shirt I remembered well. He had worn it during our summer trips to the lake, the ones that had become our quiet tradition. Seeing it again brought a wave of nostalgia so strong that tears stung my eyes. "Martha," he said softly, "I know you're overwhelmed. I knew you would be. But I need you to stay focused. There's a lot more to this cabin than anyone realizes. There are things here I discovered only after rebuilding it. Things that made me understand why I had to restore this place instead of abandoning it." He gestured off camera. "In the small drawer beneath this desk is a key. That key opens a storage box in the bedroom closet. Inside it, you'll find something important." I paused the video and rushed to the closet. The storage box was a simple wooden container. Inside lay a stack of journals, old, weathered, and written in a handwriting I didn't recognize at first. When I realized they were Edward's childhood journals, my breath caught. He had never kept diaries as an adult. I had always believed he wasn't the type. But these were different, written decades ago, filled with the private thoughts of a frightened, lonely boy. I returned to the laptop and unpaused the video. Those journals hold the truth about my relationship with Richard and Lloyd, Edward continued. They also hold details about something that happened when I was young, something that shaped the rest of my life. You'll find the story difficult, but it will explain everything. I held the journals close, unsure if I was ready to read them yet. Edward added, "You're safe in the cabin for now, but be careful who you trust in town. Some of the locals are loyal to the Vaughan cousins because they think a resort will bring them money." My stomach tightened again. "Grace Porter will help you," he said. "She's the owner of the general store. She has a good heart. You can rely on her." I didn't know who Grace was yet, but the way Edward spoke her name made me believe he trusted her deeply. The video ended, leaving me surrounded by the quiet hum of the cabin and the scent of pine drifting through the slightly open window. As evening approached, I stepped outside to gather my thoughts. The sky was turning a dusky purple, the kind of color that appears only in high altitudes. The air was crisp and carried the distant scent of wood smoke. Despite everything, the place felt peaceful. It felt like a place where healing was possible. But the stillness didn't last. A truck rolled up the driveway again, and I tensed before realizing it wasn't the Vaughan cousins. It was a woman stepping out of the driver's side. She had shoulder-length auburn hair and a warm, open face. She carried a small bag of groceries in her arms. "You must be Martha," she said kindly. "I'm Grace Porter. I saw Richard's SUV go by earlier and figured you might need a friendly face." Her presence immediately eased something inside me. "I wasn't expecting visitors today," I admitted. "Not from them, I hope," she replied, her expression darkening. "They've been trying to push everyone around lately." I invited her inside, grateful for the company. She looked around the cabin with an expression somewhere between admiration and sadness. "Edward poured his heart into this place," she said gently. "He wanted it to be perfect for you." "He never told me about any of this," I said, my voice wavering. "He didn't tell anyone," Grace replied. "But he spent a lot of time here in the last few years. We talked sometimes, mostly about little things, groceries, supplies, weather, but every now and then he'd mention you. He always looked peaceful when he spoke about you." Her words wrapped around me like a quilt. I felt a warmth I hadn't felt since before he died. She hesitated before adding, "He also mentioned he didn't trust Richard, said they'd make trouble when he was gone." "That seems to be the theme of the day," I murmured. Grace nodded sympathetically. "Well, you're not alone up here. If you need anything, supplies, help, someone to talk to, just stop by the store in town." I thanked her, and after she left, I stood on the porch for a long moment, letting the quiet of the mountains settle over me again. The stars began appearing, one by one, bright and sharp against the dark sky. It was the kind of night that should have felt peaceful, but instead it felt like the calm before something big. When I went back inside, I gathered Edward's childhood journals and placed them neatly on the desk. I wasn't ready to open them yet, but I knew I would have to soon. There was too much I didn't understand. For now, I watched one more video. Edward appeared looking tired, as though recording these messages had taken something from him. This place holds answers, Martha, he said softly. But it also holds secrets. You'll need both to survive what's coming. Trust your instincts. Trust yourself. And remember, I rebuilt this cabin with love. Everything here is here for you, even the truth. His face faded from the screen. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. And I realized I was no longer just visiting Edward's past. I was stepping into the role he had prepared for me long before he died. By the time I woke the next morning, a thin layer of snow had coated the ground, giving the cabin and the pines surrounding it a soft white glow. The air felt colder, sharper, as though the mountains themselves were paying closer attention to my presence. I made coffee in the little metal percolator on the stove, listening to it bubble while the cabin settled and creaked in the early light. I carried my cup to the window and looked out at the quiet landscape. The world seemed peaceful from inside the warm cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not in the dramatic sense, nothing moved among the trees, but a subtle awareness hovered in the air, as if Edward's warnings had seeped into the forest itself. I decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. I wanted to understand what Edward had seen in this place, what had compelled him to rebuild it, and what memories the structure still held from his childhood. The first thing I noticed was how solid everything felt. The floors, once creaky and warped according to what Edward hinted, now felt even and sturdy. The walls had been sanded smooth and repainted, and the furniture had clearly been chosen with care. Nothing was too modern or too rustic, just functional, warm, and simple. I moved through each room slowly, letting my fingers brush the surfaces Edward had worked so hard to restore. I had always known him to be meticulous at his job, but I'd never imagined him as the kind of man who could renovate an entire cabin by hand. Seeing his craftsmanship around me made his absence feel both heavier and strangely present, as though the space itself held pieces of him. The bedroom closet still held the wooden box filled with Edward's childhood journals, but I wasn't ready to open them yet. I wanted to give myself time before reading the painful memories he had buried for decades. Instead, I made my way to the small workshop behind the cabin, a shed Edward had rebuilt with new siding, a heavy padlock, and reinforced windows. The key fit easily. Inside, the workshop was surprisingly organized. Tools hung neatly from hooks, and several wooden shelves held various supplies: varnish, brushes, work gloves, boxes of screws, and small containers labeled with Edward's handwriting. A half-finished piece of furniture sat in the corner, a wooden bench with clean, elegant lines. He'd been planning to add it to the cabin, perhaps for the porch, but he never finished it. I ran my hand over the smooth surface, imagining him here, the sound of his careful sanding filling the quiet of the mountain air. A notebook sat on the workbench, and when I opened it, I recognized Edward's compact handwriting. These weren't journal entries. These were project notes. Repair roof. South corner beams still soft. Replace window latches. Master bedroom. Check spring house. Possible leaks. Cabin foundation. Reinforced, but cracks need watching. Then, one note caught my eye. Clear path to bunker. Do this alone. No contractors. I read it again, unsure I'd seen it correctly. A bunker. I flipped through the notebook, searching for more references, but there was nothing else about it. The word struck me as out of place. Edward wasn't the type to build something extreme or paranoid. He was calm, steady, focused on simple, practical solutions. What would make him need a bunker, and why would he insist on doing the work alone? Whatever the answer was, it wouldn't be obvious inside the workshop. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air, and scanned the property. The cabin sat on a gentle rise, and behind it the land sloped toward a thick patch of forest. A narrow path had been cleared, leading into the trees, a path I hadn't noticed yesterday. I followed it. Snow crunched underfoot, and my breath formed small clouds in the cold air. The deeper I walked, the thinner the trees became until the forest opened into a small clearing. A weathered stone structure sat at the center. It looked like an old root cellar or a storm shelter. The door was secured with a heavy latch, and snow partially covered the worn steps leading down. I brushed the snow aside, revealing a metal handle identical to the one Edward had installed on the workshop door. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn back, to avoid discovering whatever truth Edward had uncovered here. But another part of me, the part that had already stepped into this new reality, refused to be afraid of ghosts from his past. The latch opened with a metallic click, and the door swung inward more smoothly than I expected. A cold draft rushed up from below. I descended 3 steps before stopping. Edward had built something down here, but before I could go further, I heard a distant engine approaching from the direction of the main road. The sound echoed slightly in the cold air, bouncing off the trees. It wasn't Caleb's old truck. This motor was newer, heavier. The adrenaline surged through me faster than reason, and I hurried back toward the cabin, slipping slightly on the snow. My heart pounded a steady rhythm in my ears as I reached the porch. A silver SUV rolled into the clearing. Not Richard's SUV, not Lloyd's. A different one. The woman who stepped out looked to be in her mid-50s, tall, sharp gaze, dark hair pulled back neatly. She wore a long coat and carried a leather bag. Her posture alone told me she wasn't here by accident. She scanned the property with a calm calculation that made me uneasy. She spotted me on the porch and gave a polite, practiced smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell?" she called out. I nodded slowly. She walked closer, her boots crunching steadily on the snow. "My name is Marjorie Ellison. I'm with the county planning office." Planning office? My pulse quickened. Why would the planning office come here? This cabin wasn't part of any official expansion project, at least not to my knowledge. "I'm sorry to come without notice," Marjorie said, still wearing that composed smile. "We had some questions regarding the property and thought it best to speak with you directly." "What kind of questions?" I asked, careful not to reveal too much. "Just routine inquiries," she replied lightly, but there was nothing casual in her tone. "We've received reports that this land might be in transition soon, potentially sold, dismantled, or repurposed." I frowned. "I have no plans to sell anything." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "None at all?" "None." She studied me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she glanced toward the forest behind the cabin. "You've been exploring the property this morning?" she said. The statement wasn't accusatory, just observant, but too observant. My stomach tightened. She couldn't have known that unless she saw footprints in the snow. The trail I'd made. Her gaze drifted back to me. "I'm sure you understand," she added calmly, "that certain areas out here have to be handled with care. Historic sites, geological concerns, old mining zones." "Mining," I repeated quietly. The woman gave a small, polite shrug. "This region has older layers than most people realize. Sometimes things surface. Old records, old claims. It's always good to know what you're dealing with." The implication ran like ice through my veins. She knew something. Something about the land. Something about the bunker. "And of course," she added, "we have to consider any influences that outside parties may have on newly inherited properties." She didn't have to say their names, Richard and Lloyd. Her expression softened as she handed me a card. If anything seems out of place, or if anyone makes you feel pressured, call me. Sometimes families can be complicated. It was delivered gently, but carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Her politeness felt like another layer of warning. Quiet, measured, but unmistakably deliberate. Before I could ask more, she returned to her SUV and drove off, leaving me standing alone in the cold. Inside the cabin, I paced the living room, trying to make sense of everything. The Vaughan cousins had shown up aggressively. Caleb had warned me the land held value. Edward had mentioned secrets buried here. And now, someone from the county had come, insinuating there were old records and possible claims, and suggesting I needed to be cautious of my own complicated family. It was too many coincidences. I needed answers. I returned to the bunker entrance in the woods. This time, I brought a flashlight. As I descended the full staircase and reached the bottom, I found myself standing in a small underground room built of concrete and reinforced beams. It wasn't large, but it was sturdy. Far sturdier than anything above ground. Shelves lined the walls, storing boxes, binders, and old metal containers. A desk sat in one corner with a lamp and another small file drawer. This wasn't a panic shelter or survival zone. It was a storage room for information. I pulled a binder from the shelf and opened it. Inside were maps of the area, geological surveys, and handwritten notes, Edward's handwriting, dating back to his first purchase of the cabin decades ago. Another binder contained copies of legal documents, land transfers, property disputes, and letters referencing mining companies and disputed water rights. Letters addressed to the previous owners. Some of the letters were from the Vaughan family. My heart thudded hard as I read the notes. This land had been contested before. Not recently, not because of water, but because of something else, something deeper. As I scanned Edward's notes, one line stood out. Vaughan claim, invalid but persistent, not legally binding. Motivated by discovery made in 1983. Must secure documents before they try again. Discovery. 1983. What discovery? More pages contained references to restricted zones and unregistered shafts. And then I found a photocopy of an old map showing a cluster of tunnels beneath the property, old mining tunnels. My breath caught. Edward hadn't told me the cabin sat on abandoned mining land, and the county official had hinted at old claims. I dug deeper until I found a handwritten page that made my hands go cold. If they find it before Martha knows the truth, everything I've protected will fall apart. She must understand the full history. Everything felt suddenly heavier, like the room itself was aware of my realization. I replaced the binders and returned to the cabin, clutching the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. The air felt colder now, sharper. A storm was coming, not just from the sky. Inside, I opened the laptop again. There was a new video waiting, for today. Edward appeared with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Tired, determined, maybe even fearful. Martha, he said quietly, if you've found the underground room, you're further along than I expected by now. But you need to be careful. You're not the only one looking for it. My breath hitched. He continued. The Vaughan cousins believe the land belongs to them because of something buried here. They'll tell you it's about water rights, or development, or ownership. But that's not the reason. They've been trying to reclaim something since we were children. He paused, leaning closer to the camera. And what they're trying to find is dangerous. The video ended abruptly, not with a goodbye, not with reassurance, just a blank screen staring back at me, And beyond the window, somewhere in the cold quiet of the woods, I heard the distant crunch of footsteps in fresh snow, slow, deliberate, and far too close to be harmless. I stood at the window for almost a full minute, barely breathing, listening for that sound again. Snow has a way of carrying footsteps farther than they should go. Every small crack or crunch seems sharper in the cold. My heart beat so loudly that it felt like it echoed in my ears, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I imagined the noise or if someone really was out there. The woods behind the cabin were darker than before. Clouds had rolled in fast, turning the afternoon light into a dull grey. It would snow again soon, and the more I stared into the trees, the more I felt that familiar prickle along my neck, the one that tells you you're being watched, even when you can't see anyone. I stepped back from the window slowly. I wasn't panicking, but I wasn't calm either. A widow alone in a cabin in the mountains. A husband who had left secrets behind. Cousins who wanted the land back. A county official who appeared without warning, and now footsteps in the snow. It was all too much to ignore. I locked the doors. Not that a simple lock would keep out anyone determined, but it made me feel a little safer. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the cabin walls. The sound was almost like someone dragging their hand along the wood. I forced myself to breathe and went to the kitchen to boil water for tea. Something warm to hold in my hands while the world outside grew colder. Every few minutes, I checked the windows again. Nothing. No one. But the uneasy feeling stayed. I sat at the table, staring at the laptop Edward left for me. His video from earlier kept replaying in my mind. You're not the only one looking for it. And then, what they're trying to find is dangerous. Dangerous. That was the part that wouldn't let me rest. Edward had been the kind of man who rarely used strong words unless he meant them. He didn't scare easily. He didn't exaggerate. If he said something was dangerous, I had to take it seriously. But what could possibly be hidden under this land? I'd seen the mining maps, the old tunnels, the notes about 1983 and the Vaughan cousins trying to claim the area. But nothing I read explained why anyone would come walking around in the woods at dusk. Nothing explained why the planning office would show up without warning. Nothing explained why Edward spent months building a secret bunker under the shed. A soft knock at the front door made me jump so hard I spilled my tea. It wasn't loud, just a single rap. I froze in place. The knock came again. One push of knuckles against the wood. Not hurried, not frantic, but careful. As if whoever stood there wanted me to know they weren't trying to break in, but also weren't leaving until I opened the door. I held my breath and went to the entryway. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's Caleb," came the reply, his familiar, steady drawl. "Didn't mean to startle you." Relief washed through me so fast I felt weak. I opened the door, but only a little, just enough to see his face. He looked worried. His coat was dusted with snow, his hair damp from the cold, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't step inside, not until I motioned him to come in. "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't speak right away. He glanced around the room, then toward the windows, as if he expected someone else to be nearby. "You should close the door," he said quietly. I did. He kept his voice low. I was driving back from the service road and saw tracks. Fresh ones. Someone walked right past the back of the cabin. My stomach tightened. "I heard them." He nodded. "I figured you might have. They didn't come down the main trail. These were different. Whoever it was circled the cabin and went back into the trees." "For how long?" I asked. A while, he admitted. Tracks show they stopped more than once. The idea made me shiver. Someone had stood near the cabin long enough to leave deeper prints. Someone had been watching. What do they want? I whispered. Caleb exhaled slowly. What everybody wants in this part of the mountain. Answers. Or access. To what? He hesitated. Did your husband ever talk about the land under this place? He said almost nothing, I answered. He only ever told me to stay away, never explained why. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face. That man should have told you the truth a long time ago. Not because you needed to worry, but because secrets don't stay buried up here. He looked tired, much older than he had yesterday. You deserve to know, he added. Know what? He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. This belonged to your husband. He left it with me last year. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should give it to you only when the time was right. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I wasn't sure you were ready for it. And because once you see this, there's no going back. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a hand-drawn map, not of the cabin or the workshop. This was a map of the underground tunnels, the mine, and one section was circled in red ink. A small note next to it read, 1983, never open. Seal reinforced. Dangerous gas pockets. Collapsed chamber. Human remains. My breath left me in a rush. Human remains. Caleb nodded grimly. That's why he rebuilt this place. Not to hide anything, but to protect people from going where they shouldn't. The Vaughns found out there was something down there. Something their granddad thought was valuable. They've been chasing after it ever since. But they don't know what's actually under that land. I stared at the map. What's under it? Caleb placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. A collapse that took 2 men and nearly took a third. Old miners. Their bodies were never recovered. And whatever the Vaughns think is down there, gold, silver, old equipment, it's buried under unstable rock and pockets of toxic air. And Edward helped seal it? He didn't just seal it, Caleb said. He rebuilt the entire structure above it so no one would ever dig there again. When he found out you'd inherit the place someday, he made sure you wouldn't accidentally walk into something deadly. I swallowed hard. Why wouldn't he tell me? Caleb's eyes softened. Because he loved you, and because he carried guilt from what happened in that mine, even though he wasn't the one who caused the collapse. He was a kid back then, younger than 12. But he was there that day. He saw everything, and he was the one who ran for help. He just wasn't fast enough. I gripped the edge of the table. The room felt smaller. So the Vaughn cousins want to uncover that place? Why? Because their grandfather believed something valuable was buried with those men, some kind of metal casing or old equipment prototype. Turns out it was nothing more than a broken drilling panel. But the story stuck, and that family has held on to that story for decades, passed down like a treasure map. That's absurd, I whispered. It is, Caleb agreed. But obsession doesn't follow logic. They think they're owed that spot on the mountain, and now that your husband is gone, they think you're easier to push around. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I trusted my voice. Caleb continued. The county office knows about the dangers underground. They've tried for years to keep the Vaughns from digging. When you inherited the place, the office flagged the property for review. That woman today wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling you everything either. I nodded slowly. She mentioned old mining zones. She didn't mention that 2 months ago, one of the Vaughns tried drilling again without permission. Caused a sinkhole on the edge of the old claim. They're desperate, and desperate people don't think straight. A chill settled over me. Why come near the cabin? Caleb lowered his voice even more. Because the original entrance to the collapsed tunnel is somewhere on your side of the property line, not on theirs. Everything inside me went cold. So they're looking for it. They're hunting for it, he corrected. And if they think you've found something, anything, they'll keep coming. I pressed the back of my hand to my forehead, trying to steady my breathing. I found the bunker today. Caleb stared at me. What bunker? The one in the woods, beneath the shed. His face drained of color. Martha, there isn't supposed to be a bunker under the shed. Yes, there is. Edward built it. No, he said, firmer. Edward reinforced the walls of the workshop and built a storage room under the cabin foundation. But under the shed, that wasn't part of his plan. That structure is older. I felt the world tilt slightly. Older. Take me there, Caleb said quickly. Now. We bundled up and walked out into the cold, snow crunching under our boots. The sky had turned a deeper grey. A storm was coming fast. Caleb walked ahead with long, determined steps. But when we reached the clearing, he stopped abruptly. He looked at the wooden door in the ground, then at the steps leading down, and shook his head. This wasn't part of the renovation. I went down earlier, I said quietly. How far? To the base of the stairs. There's a room. Concrete walls. That's impossible, Caleb said. Those walls would have taken weeks to pour, and the shed was untouched before your husband started repairing it. Then who built it? Caleb didn't answer. He pushed past me and started down the steps. I followed, holding my breath as the cold air sank deeper around us. When we reached the bottom, he stood still for a full 10 seconds. This isn't new, he murmured. These supports, this style, it's from the 80s. This was built right after the collapse. Someone started a dig before the county shut it down. Why didn't Edward tell me? I asked. Caleb traced the beam above us with his fingers. Because he didn't know. A faint sound echoed through the tunnel. A soft shuffle. A scuff of grit. Not from us. From deeper inside the wall. Caleb turned off his flashlight instantly. Don't move, he whispered. I froze. The sound came again. Slow. Careful. Like someone shifting their weight in the dark. The storm wind howled above us, but the noise here was quieter, closer. After a moment that felt far too long, Caleb exhaled. We're leaving, he whispered. Right now. We climbed back up into the freezing air and shut the door behind us. The wind had kicked up snow and was whipping through the clearing with sharp, stinging flakes. Inside the cabin again, both of us breathing hard. Caleb spoke first. This is worse than I thought. They're not just searching around the cabin anymore. They're under it. I stared at him. What do I do? He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the laptop Edward had left. You watch the next video, he said. He planned for all this. Maybe he left instructions. Maybe he left warnings. And you? I'll stay until the storm passes. Then I'm calling someone I trust at the county. Not the planning office. Someone higher. The wind hammered the cabin walls again. Somewhere outside, something cracked. Maybe it was a tree limb in the storm. Or maybe it wasn't. Either way, I opened Edward's laptop with shaking hands. The next video loaded. His face appeared again, solemn and tired. Martha, he said softly, if you're watching this one, something has already gone wrong. The storm outside roared, and inside the cabin, every part of me knew Whatever secret my husband had tried to bury, it wasn't buried anymore. I pressed play with a tight feeling in my chest. The storm shook the walls, and the video flickered for a moment before it settled. Edward sat in a chair I didn't recognize, maybe an older version of the workshop before he rebuilt it. His hair was shorter, and he looked tired, as if he had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "Martha," he said slowly, "if you reached this video, it means something is forcing you to look deeper. I hoped you would never need this one." I sank into the couch, my heart beating in my throat. He continued, "There's something I never told you, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want you living in fear of a past you had no part in. But the Vaughns, they won't stop. Not now. Not after all these years." His voice lowered. "They're not looking for treasure. They're not looking for old tools. They're looking for proof." I frowned, not understanding. "Proof of what, Edward?" I whispered, my eyes glued to the screen. "Proof of what really caused the collapse in 1983, he said. "Because their grandfather told a lie to protect his pride. A lie that blamed my father. And for decades, their whole family has believed it." He swallowed hard. "My father didn't cause the collapse. He died trying to stop it." I felt my breath catch. Edward rarely talked about his father. When he did, the words were short, quiet, and painful. He went on. "The mine was unstable long before that day. The Vaughns knew it. The company knew it. But they pushed those men to dig deeper because they wanted to meet a quota. My father begged them to slow down, to reinforce the tunnels. They ignored him." My hands tightened around the edge of the laptop. "On the day of the collapse," Edward said, "he ran inside after hearing the first crack. He tried to pull out the men who were still in the west chamber. He saved one. The other two?" He paused, and for a moment he couldn't speak. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. "He didn't make it out," Edward finally said. Snow pounded against the windows, making the whole cabin feel smaller. "My father died a hero," Edward whispered. "But the Vaughn family couldn't accept that. Their grandfather was supposed to supervise that shift. He was supposed to call off the dig. Instead, he blamed the whole disaster on my father and hid the real cause. The company backed him because it saved them money, and because no one wants to admit they sent men into a death trap." My voice trembled as I spoke aloud to the empty room. "So that's why they hate you." "They don't hate me," Edward corrected softly. "They fear what I know, and what I could prove. Even after all these years, the truth still matters, because lawsuits, property claims, even land rights all tie back to that collapse. If someone proves the Vaughns lied, everything they've gained since then falls apart." I leaned back slowly, trying to take it all in. The Vaughns hadn't been searching for treasure. They weren't protecting family pride. They were protecting a lie so old it had hardened into stone. Edward's voice drew me back to the screen. "After my father died, I kept away from this place for decades. Then, when the county started digging through old mining files a few years ago, I knew the past would come up again. That's when I bought the cabin. That's when I started searching." "For what?" I whispered. "For evidence," he said. "Records, equipment, old reports that were supposed to be destroyed. And something else. Something left behind in that collapsed tunnel." He leaned closer. The screen showed lines around his eyes I had never noticed before. "One of the men who died that day wasn't from here. He kept a notebook. He wrote everything down. Every safety issue. Every shortcut the company took. Every complaint your father made that they ignored." My pulse kicked hard. "If that notebook still exists," Edward said, It destroys the Vaughan's story. Completely. I sat perfectly still. They think I found it, he said. I didn't, but I found something else, something almost as dangerous. I swallowed. What did you find? A second entrance. My skin prickled. Not the one you found today. A deeper one. Hidden in the oldest part of the mine. It wasn't made by the company. It was made later. Secretly. Maybe by the men before the collapse. Maybe by the Vaughans afterward. I don't know who carved it out. He rubbed his forehead, as if remembering the cold air underground. But I do know this. It leads to the chamber the Vaughans want, and if anyone goes in without the proper support, the whole thing could collapse again. My heart thudded painfully. So, if the cousins think you know where it is, I said softly to the laptop, they'll follow you. Edward nodded, as if he heard me. They already did, twice. They came after me. First politely, then not so politely. My mouth went dry. That's why I rebuilt everything, he said. To protect you. To protect anyone who came here after me. To make sure no one could wander into the wrong place by mistake. The storm outside slammed something against the cabin wall, making me flinch. Martha, Edward said gently, the truth is this. You're in danger, not because of the land's value, but because the Vaughans believe you might find something that could expose their whole family. He took a slow breath. I know you're strong. I know you don't scare easily. But please don't face this alone. Tell someone you trust. And if the Vaughans come again, don't argue. Don't reason with them. They won't stop until they believe they've erased the past. He paused one last time. Remember, this mountain doesn't forget, and neither do the people who lost someone here. The screen went black. I sat silently for several seconds, feeling the cabin sway under the weight of wind and memory. The truth Edward revealed settled heavily in my chest. This wasn't just a land dispute. This wasn't about money. This was a buried story with roots deeper than the mine itself. And now I was standing in the center of it. A sharp thud hit the porch. Then another. Caleb and I looked toward the door at the same time. Someone was outside, and they weren't waiting for an invitation. The thud on the porch made both Caleb and me freeze. The wind roared outside, but that sound had been too heavy, too close, too direct to be the storm. Something, or someone, was out there, and they weren't trying to hide it anymore. Caleb stepped toward the window cautiously. Stay back, he whispered, though his voice was calm. He lifted the edge of the curtain just an inch. His shoulders stiffened. They're here, he said softly. My heart sank. The Vaughan cousins? I see two figures, he murmured. One tall, one shorter, heavy coats. They're standing by the railing? The knock came then. Not a gentle one this time. A solid, demanding pound that echoed through the cabin. I swallowed. What do they want now? Caleb lowered the curtain. The same thing they've wanted for 40 years. They think something under this land belongs to them. And now they think you know where it is. He looked at me, waiting. I realized he wouldn't speak for me. This was my cabin, my decision. So, I walked to the door. My knees shook a little, but my back stayed straight. I opened it only a few inches. Two men stood on the porch, snow sticking to their coats, their eyes sharp with impatience. Lloyd and Richard Vaughan. Their faces looked worn and tired, but their expressions carried a kind of stubborn hunger, like men who had chased something too long and forgotten how to let go. Evening, Mrs. Caldwell, Richard said. We need to talk. His tone had no warmth, no attempt at kindness. Caleb stepped behind me, silent but present. I didn't open the door wider. It's late, and this isn't the time for visitors. Richard gave a thin smile. We don't really care about the time. He nodded toward the woods. We saw lights down by the old shed earlier. Looked like someone was down there. My breath caught. They had seen us. Lloyd stepped forward, trying to sound calm. We just want to know what you found. That's all. If you know where it is, you can save all of us a lot of trouble. There's nothing here for you, I said quietly. Lloyd's expression hardened. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. They exchanged a look. Richard started to speak again, but Caleb stepped into view. That's enough, Caleb said. She told you to leave. Richard's jaw tightened. You don't belong in this, Caleb. I've belonged on this mountain longer than either of you, he said evenly. Now get off her porch. That did it. The cousins realized they weren't going to win anything tonight, not through force, not through intimidation, not through their silent watching. They stared at me one last time, long, hard, almost desperate. This isn't finished, Richard said. I know, I replied. They turned and walked back through the snow toward their truck. When they were out of sight, I shut the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly, letting the fear pass through me like a wave. Caleb stayed close. They're leaving for tonight, but they'll be back. I know, I whispered, steadying myself. The storm rattled the cabin. The windows trembled. But for the first time, something inside me didn't tremble with them. I had spent my whole life being careful, being quiet, being the person who never raised her voice, never stirred conflict, never invited trouble. But Edward had believed I was stronger than that. And sitting here now, I felt that strength waking up in me. Caleb, I said, I need to go back to the bunker tomorrow. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. Then I'll go with you. The storm passed overnight. By morning, the world was blanketed in white, soft and clean, as though the mountain had pressed pause on everything. The Vaughan's truck tracks were buried under fresh snow. The air was quiet, calm. But I could feel a tension under it, old stories waiting to be uncovered. We ate breakfast in silence. Then we layered up and left for the shed. Snow fell from branches as we walked. The sky had lightened, but the cold still carried a bite. When we reached the clearing, I felt that same uneasy pull I'd felt the day before, like something down there was waiting. Caleb opened the door, and we walked down the stairs. Our breath fogged the air. This time, though, we didn't stop in the small room. We searched every shelf, every box, every binder. Slowly, piece by piece. The truth came together like a puzzle. Old newspaper clippings, mining reports, incident logs, maps with red markings, black markings, even places where the ink had faded completely. And then, in a rusted metal drawer near the back, we found it. A small notebook wrapped in a piece of cloth. My hands shook as I lifted it out. The cloth was fragile with age, and the notebook inside looked battered and stained. But the writing was still there. The name on the inside cover made my stomach twist. Property of Samuel Hart, one of the men who died in the collapse. I opened to the first page. His handwriting was small but neat. He had written dates, warnings, measurements of cracks along the tunnel walls. He recorded conversations between miners. He listed every time they told the foreman about strange noises, shifting stones, and the smell of gas. Then I flipped to the last entry. The words were shaky. Tunnel is not safe. If we don't stop, someone will die. Foreman Vaughan says we push ahead. Don't like this. Not at all. The writing stopped there. The date was the day of the collapse. Caleb let out a long breath. This is what Edward was looking for. The truth sat heavy in my hands. Samuel Hart's notebook wasn't treasure. It wasn't money. It wasn't gold or silver or anything shiny. It was proof. Proof that the Vaughan's grandfather had ignored warnings. Proof that he had lied. Proof that two families' grief had been shaped by a single choice made in pride and arrogance. I felt both grief and relief. Grief for the lives lost. Relief that Edward's father had died trying to save others, not causing their deaths. Caleb placed a steady hand on my shoulder. This is enough. Enough to end their claim. Enough to stop them from digging. Enough to put the truth to rest. I nodded, holding the notebook close. And Edward knew I'd find it. Because he trusted you, Caleb said, more than he trusted anyone. That afternoon, I called the county official, Marjorie Ellison. She came before sunset, her breath forming clouds in the cold as she approached the cabin. "You found something," she said simply. I placed the notebook on the table between us. She opened it carefully. I watched her expression change page by page. When she finished, she rested her hand on the worn cover. "This is old," she said, "and powerful, and exactly what we needed." "And the Vaughans?" I asked. Her eyes softened. "This ends their claim. It ends any right they thought they had to dig, and it will finally set the record straight, legally and historically." For the first time in days, my shoulders relaxed. The danger wasn't magically gone, but the power had shifted, and it wasn't in their hands anymore. 2 days later, the Vaughan cousins came back. But they weren't angry. They looked tired, defeated, like men who had chased a story for too many years and finally realized the ending wasn't theirs to write. "We know you found something," Richard said. "We heard the county's already involved." I nodded. "Your grandfather lied. The truth is in the notebook." Lloyd swallowed, his voice quieter. "We didn't know." "For your sake," I said gently. "I hope that's true." They didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They simply nodded once and walked away, leaving tracks in the snow that looked more like surrender than retreat. I watched them go without anger, just a quiet ache. This mountain had taken enough from all of us. Maybe now it could rest. That evening, I made a fire and sat alone in the living room. Edward's laptop rested on the coffee table. One last video waited. I pressed play. Edward smiled, softer than before. "If you're watching this, Martha," he said, "you found the truth. And I hope you found a little peace, too." He paused. "You're stronger than you know. This cabin, this land, it's yours now. Not because of what's under it, but because of who you are, and because of what you do with it." He leaned closer. "Live here if it feels right. Leave if it doesn't. But whatever you choose, don't live in fear. This mountain has taken enough from us. Let it give you something instead." His smile warmed gently, filling the room. "Love the quiet. Love the space. Love the life you still have ahead of you." The video ended. I closed the laptop and sat quietly as the fire crackled. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, I felt something settle in my chest. Not grief, not fear, but a kind of acceptance. The truth had been buried under this mountain for 40 years. Now it was free, and so was I. This place was no longer the cabin Edward feared. It was the home he left me, And as the wind softened outside and the fire warmed my hands, I whispered into the stillness, "I'm here, Edward, and I'm safe." The mountain held its silence, a peaceful silence this time, one I could finally live with.